Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode on a Tuesday night of our Sharia Crime Stoppers Enemies Within webinar series. Tonight, we're going to talk about a topic that's really important, and that is the ugly truth that is festering inside mosques in America. You know we have a large number, but you might have heard the number 3,200. Isn't it interesting that, for the most part, most of us know nothing about what happens in these mosques, even the ones in our own neighborhood? Our guests tonight are going to provide you with lots and lots of detail of what goes on inside the mosques. We have Dave Gaubatz and David Bores are going to be with us. They're both on camera. Good evening, gentlemen. And we also have Mary Verbicki as well with us tonight. We are going to speak in detail. Let's just start with Dave Gaubatz. Dave has been inside of hundreds of mosques in America, and he's done a detailed and rigorous evaluation of these mosques and provided reports. We'll talk about that in detail. And of course, as you know, David Bores is our co-founder of Sharia Crime Stoppers, retired police chief with a long experience of spreading the message and teaching the class that he teaches, and has taught many, many times in the southern part of the United States to law enforcement. This is the training that was removed from, was made unavailable to local law enforcement by the Justice Department and the FBI back in 2011 and 12 because of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Dave is our trainer. David Bores is our trainer. Dave Gaubatz is our on-site investigator with years of experience in the intelligence field. Dave Gaubatz, why don't you say hello to the audience and give us just a little background about your background and your work before you started studying mosques.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's an honor to speak with everyone tonight. I want to briefly tell you a little bit about my background because I think it's important to do that in order to show why what I'm saying about a particular mosque has credibility. I was in the Air Force for over 20 years with OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, top secret clearances and beyond. After that, I was a federal agent for almost 15 years, primarily worked counterterrorism, counterintelligence, been going through the Middle East since the 1970s, started with Saudi Arabia. So I've been studying Islam and mosques for many, many years. I attended the State Department Arabic language course several years ago, right after 9/11. I've dedicated my life to exposing mosques here in America. So far, I've been in over 300 mosques in America and 125 mosques throughout the Middle East. I can tell you and sum it up in a couple words. We have a serious, serious problem inside America. When we talk about Islamic sleeper cells, we can build the walls which need to be done, really needs to be done. But right now, today, there are enough sleeper cells, such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and a dozen other acronyms, already inside America that could cause 100 9/11 type of attacks. I've been inside these mosques. I've been trained by senior Al-Qaeda members who have left Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I've had firsthand experience with them. They've taken me into mosques. They've shown me what to look for. I've developed criteria on how to rate these mosques from dangerous to very, very dangerous. So that's a bit of a background. So I'll leave it to you, Dick. You go ahead and tell me what you want me to discuss.
Okay, well, I think actually it looks to me like we've got a person that's joined us. There we go. We're going to begin, we're going to dive into how the Muslim Brotherhood thinks of mosques, etc. But before we do that, we just want to give you an example of a recent evaluation that Dave Gaubatz has done. And to do that, we're going to bring in Scott.
Sounds good.
All right, well, we just wanted to inject a specific situation. We're going to talk about a couple of cases. This is a case in New England. We're going to talk about something that's recent in Georgia. And in just a moment, we're going to bring David Bores in to kind of give us the big view about the Muslim Brotherhood and how they approach it. But let's talk about a specific one just to get the audience's attention. Scott, tell us the story. You're up in New England. Just give us a background about what you saw, what happened, and how you involved Dave Gaubatz.
Well, 2 years ago, June 30th, I went into a mosque up in New Hampshire with Dave, and we went in and I gathered my literature. Obviously, I took my shoes off, and then we went in and Dave introduced me as a brother, and he sat me down and I put my literature down on the floor, and then this other guy that was already in the mosque with no arm came over and he picked up all my literature, kissed it, said some stuff in Arabic, and he went and set it down and told me I could get it when I left. Then after that, shortly after that, Dave came over to me and gave me a book, and on page 377, it had said, "Bury girls alive." And I was so shocked I could barely read what was underneath it. All I remember was something about blood. And then shortly after that, I went in to use the bathroom, and then I went to wash my hands, which I thought was very unusual. There was a lot of water right on the floor where you wash your hands. So then I went back, and the place filled up, and there was three things that the Imam said that you had to do to be a good Muslim. The first one he said was, life is short. When you die, pass all your money on to charity. The second thing he said was knowledge. It's your duty to pass on your knowledge. And the next thing that he said was children, to teach your children Islam and the Quran and have plenty of children. And then towards the end of it, they told me to leave. They told me to get out. And then I remember when Dave came back out to the vehicle, he said he couldn't believe how hostile they were to me. And that's pretty much it.
That's your recollection. Dave Gaubatz, from your perspective, why don't you take this specific story and kind of talk a little bit about how you proceed, how you enter the mosque, what you try to accomplish during your time in the mosque. We also want to hear the fact that you have an evaluation system and you write a report. So take that story and maybe give us a specific example of what you did up there.
Yeah, in order to go into a mosque, one must fully understand Sharia law. Sharia law covers everything a Muslim does 24 hours a day, from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep, and even while they're sleeping. So when I go into a mosque, I have studied Islam for over 30 years. I know probably more about Sharia law and Islam than most Muslims in America understand about Sharia law. I've even been asked to teach Sharia courses inside a mosque when I went undercover there for over 2 weeks. I'm very Sharia compliant. That's how you get into a mosque and be accepted so that you can get information. But Sharia law is the key. The materials, like in New Hampshire, the materials at all the mosques are very important. I want to find out, are they using the same materials that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the dozens of other acronyms actually use? I want to know if Prophet Muhammad, the pseudo-Prophet Muhammad, would be happy and pleased in that particular mosque. When I do my evaluation, I want to know, would he be pleased? I want to know, would ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole, would they be pleased? And as Scott mentioned, I can tell you that in New Hampshire, they would be very, very pleased. And Georgia, my recent mosque study, they would be very, very pleased. They are very, very dangerous. They are a threat to our great country, America. They are a threat to our children.
Well, Scott, are you still with us, Scott?
I am.
Okay, let's, I think your well, fine, we can hear you fine. So Scott, let's, you and David maybe talk about what happened afterwards. So Dave Gaubatz comes out with content. You give it a score from 1 to 10. Am I right, Dave?
Yes.
And what was the score you gave it?
Yeah, I think if I recall, that one was a high 9, close to 10.
Okay.
Very, very dangerous.
Okay, and then you basically prepare a report.
I prepare a report. I give it to the public first, because when I left federal service and while I was with the government, the majority of information intelligence that is obtained is put into a safe. It's marked classified, secret, top secret, whatever it may be, just simply to keep it out of the public hands. Not necessarily that it is a threat to national security, but it is something that they don't want the public to know. So I made, in 2003, when I left Iraq, left the federal service, I made it a point. Anything that I do is going to first get released to the public, and then it would be released to our law enforcement and politicians and the media. It's got to be the public that demands our senior leaders actually do their job. Thus far, they're not. As in New Hampshire, as Scott mentioned, we did a report, gave it to different officials. The first thing, as normal, is they say, well, Dave Gaubatz is a hater, Islamophobe, a racist, and all the other words. That even comes from conservatives, not just the liberals, but conservatives, as in New Hampshire, a police chief was supposedly conservative. They are more concerned about political correctness than they are in protecting the children, American children here in our country.
So, Scott, let's be specific. What was the location of the mosque? What town were we in?
Manchester, New Hampshire.
All right, Manchester, New Hampshire. By the way, just a footnote, I'm aware that our good friend Jim Simpson wrote about this case. Jim Simpson, I think, went to New Hampshire. Keep in mind that this part of New Hampshire has, I remember the number, the public schools train or have to work with dozens and dozens and dozens of languages. So a major destination point for refugees, and obviously that's how the mosque got built, probably. So Scott, what's your recollection of when Dave Gaubatz's report, I believe you sign it, you do whatever you need to do to make it a well-documented case, potentially available to law enforcement at the beginning of an investigation. Scott, what was your reaction when you saw the reaction? And I assume Dave was called a racist and an Islamophobe. Maybe you were too.
Well, I gave that actual report to a lot of elected officials in the area. I gave it to law enforcement, and nothing actually happened. I also bumped into Corey Lewandowski at the airport in October of 17. I gave it all to him, and he said he would look into it. And in that same month, October of 17, Governor Sununu went into the mosque and said he had a wonderful meet and greets.
Wow. Governor Sununu, if I'm not mistaken, at that time, and he is a Republican governor. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, he is.
Okay. Okay. Well, that seems to be the challenge. The challenge is, first of all, typically nobody knows what goes on in a mosque. Then we get a professional evaluation, and depending on the climate in the community, it's either rejected out of hand. Can I ask a question? Did you ever get any questions about the detail in the report? Any questions at all about page 2, page 3, this point?
Well, this is coming from me. I have not. I want the listeners to understand, when I go into a mosque, I use firsthand evidence only, not second, third, not something that I simply read on the internet that's been in the newspaper. I was a federal agent. If it's not firsthand evidence, I do not use it. Many of my researchers, because I've been called an Islamophobe, many of my actual researchers that have went into the 300 mosques with me are actual Muslims that have told me what to look for. They've trained me what to look for. So I have Muslims on my team. I have Christians. I have Jewish people. As far as being an Islamophobe or racist, my life was saved by some Muslim families in Iraq on more than one occasion. I love many people who are affiliated with the Muslim ideology, yet I tell many of these same people, many Muslims throughout the United States, throughout the Middle East, they do not follow Sharia law 100%. And when you do not follow it 100%, you are essentially an apostate of Islam, subject to the penalty of death. So in a good sense, we have many people throughout the world who identify with Islam, but in actuality, they're no more than an apostate. I've went into at least 5 mosques where I did pseudo-conversions in these mosques. And so, of course, I'm considered an apostate as well. But first-hand evidence, I would like to first mention a mosque in Nashville before I forget about this. I went to a particular mosque a few years back and spent almost 2 weeks in a mosque. It was a Sunni mosque right in Nashville, Al Farouk Mosque. I took a female researcher with me. We went inside, spent time going to Sharia classes. In one of the classes, there was a little girl about 7 years old who was sitting next to my female researcher. The little girl started talking to my researcher, told my researcher that her legs were hurting. She said, "My back is hurting." And my researcher was stunned. She said, "Well, what's wrong, honey? Well, what happened?" And the little girl showed her bruises and welts on her arm, raised her shirt, showed her welts and bruises, deep welts and bruises on her back. The little girl said, they beat us when we don't do Sharia right here at the mosque. And then the little girl started talking about her husband. She said, my husband does this, my husband does that. I found in that particular mosque material authorizing and advocating child marriages to children as young as 6 years old. We had audio, we had video of this little girl talking. First thing I did was say, time out. I wanted to immediately go to law enforcement because we had something that was endangering a child. Religion did not matter. The child was innocent. I was several times told it is a political, it is a religious right under Islam for what they're doing in the mosque. They did not want to get involved. It took me almost a year before I finally got help for that little girl. She was removed from the mosque, the people that she was with. Eventually, they did close that mosque down, but it took me over a year to do that, even contacting congressmen, senators, Muslim organizations. No one wanted to help that little 7-year-old child. That's what I find in mosques all across the United States. I found it in New Hampshire. I found it in Georgia. I found it in California. It's all over. They're advocating slavery. They're advocating the marriage of young children. And it's really the rape of young children is what it is. They're advocating that. They're advocating sedition and treason against our government and the American people. This is based only on firsthand evidence. I do not use the Quran as my evidence because I'm no more of an Islamic scholar than I am a Christian scholar. But I do understand firsthand evidence written in 2018, 2019 that calls for the overthrow of our government. That is firsthand evidence, and as David Bores, a former police chief, a great person who knows Islam is better than anyone, I would say, in the United States, is trying to get pointed out. Our law enforcement at the senior levels need to start acting on that, and or we're going to go over the fine line in America like it has been in England, Germany, Norway, and other locations, France. We're going to go over that line, and we're not going to be able to recover from it.
Well, Dave, thank you very much. And Scott, David Boris, why don't you kind of bring us up to speed? You've got specific examples. Let's take a little bit of a broader view. David, help us understand when you train law enforcement, what do you tell them about the way that the Muslim Brotherhood, as prominent as they are in America, how does the Muslim Brotherhood position mosques?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood's position about mosques is all laid out in their explanatory memorandum, which I'm sure many listeners tonight are well familiar with. We've talked about it on many sessions before. Before I get into that, though, I just want to remind everybody that we are considered in the house of war because our country yet is not dominated and run by Sharia law. So any country that is not dominated and run by Sharia law is considered the house of war, the Dar al-Harb. And mosques, according to the Muslim Brotherhood, are the axis of their movement. It is the key aspect of their movement of subversion to take over a country. Mosques are considered outposts or rebats in the house of war. So the best analogy I can give for a mosque that people understand is not a house of worship, but an armory. The Muslim Brotherhood in the document clearly say that mosques are to replicate the purpose of the mosque, the original mosque in Medina that Muhammad established, and that was a military headquarters. It was a place to house the resources of war, to house prisoners of war, to conduct war planning. And oh, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood say in their explanatory memorandum, mosques are also a niche of for our prayers, almost as an afterthought. Are they for religious expression and purpose? So just as Dave Gaubatz has thoroughly outlined for us, these mosques are something entirely different than what we're used to in a Methodist, Baptist, or Jewish synagogue, or a church for that matter. These are not houses of worship as we understand it. They serve a variety of purposes, many of which are sinister to our country and part of the subversion to take us over.
David Bores, in your class, and by the way, Mary and I are graduates of the class. Happy to have successfully completed the class. With and I think when we took it, Mary, there were 60 law enforcement people in the class listening, really enthralled by David's 2-day class. David, when you talk about the Yerushalmi Mordecai Kedar study of 100 mosques, can you just kind of summarize what you teach about the 100 mosque study? Just again,
well, that is something Dave Gaubatz can speak to because he headed that study up. But I do tell peace officers and attendees the general findings of the study that Dave Gaubatz and his associates conducted, and that is over 80% of the mosques that were surveyed are advocating and promoting violence in this country. There are Sharia compliant mosques, and the more Sharia compliant the mosque is, the greater the threat they are to us, and the more likely the Imam or religious leaders, those people that the Imam has as guest speakers and others, will be to promote violence. So this is what's being taught at the mosque, this is what's being advocated at the mosque, and this is why so many mosques are hotbeds for radicalization in this country. You think about all the people that have been radicalized since 9/11 that we know about, virtually every one of them has a tie to some mosque, some place that facilitated their radicalization.
David Bores, can you just repeat the statistics again? What was the percentage in that study that was where the Sharia compliance was such that there was a tendency for Sharia crime, including Sharia violence, namely mass murder, jihad? Is that 80%? Did I hear it correctly?
I think it was, well, I think the exact total is probably closer to 83%.
Okay.
Dave Gaubatz would tell you that it's probably higher than that, but that's what's documented in this study.
And again, let's just go back to Dave Gaubatz. Dave, we have 3,200 mosques. The study looked at 100 and came up with those statistics. I think in our conversation the other day, you made a comment. Your expectation is there are many more than 3,200 mosques. Can you just give us that comment again? Just put it out there for people to try to digest what you said about the number of mosques you think exist.
Yes, when I go to a particular mosque, I try to find out how many other mosques are in that area. Based on my study, going to well over 300 mosques in America, I can tell you for every one mosque that you can find on the internet or that Islamic organizations will admit because they have nonprofit licenses, for every one mosque that is known, you probably have 2 others that are not. A mosque does not have to be this pretty building that you see is typical like in Saudi Arabia. Many of the mosques that I found in America that no one, including law enforcement, knew about in cities are sometimes put in gang-infested neighborhoods. They're in the basements. They're in homes. They're in the backs of convenience stores. I've went into back of convenience stores, went through the prayers. They have the materials. They're not licensed. They have no nonprofit license. They do not want it to be made public. They want to hide it from the public and law enforcement. One thing that's important before I forget this, when I go into a mosque and I spend more than just a few days, I start developing a relationship with the Islamic leaders. Many times I have asked, why has there not been another 9/11 such attack in America? Why have we only seen small attacks? The imams have told me, they've said, Dave, right now in America, we are winning the war here. Islam is winning. They are achieving what their ultimate goal is, which is someday to have an Islamic Ummah nation in America under strict Sharia law. They said if there was another 9/11 attack right now, it would set their movement back 25 years. They said they fully understand there are going to be individuals who will carry out small attacks, such as at Fort Hood, the Boston bombings, and a dozen others. They know that there are going to be people who will do that, but the first thing they do is with the media and law enforcement is tell them that they are lone wolves, have nothing to do with Islam, which is not true. They are very much affiliated with Islam and Sharia law. Many of the mosques I've went to, I've rated as very, very dangerous. something is going to happen. One of the worshipers is going to go out and do something similar to at Fort Hood. I went to a particular one in Utah. I wrote a report. I said, that one is very dangerous. There are many people inside that mosque. Something is going to happen soon. Someone is going to carry out an attack. If you research Trolley Square, Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, I went to that mosque 2 weeks before an attack happened. After I left, I wrote the report. I provided it to law enforcement, politicians, and the public. 2 weeks later, an individual walked out of the mosque with a shotgun, went into the shopping center, and started calling for attacks against Christians and Jews, and then killed several people. It's happening all across the U.S. They are being taught violence. We are in for a war that if we're not prepared, we're going to lose.
Let me go back to Scott Hayes for a second. Scott, it sounds like the leadership in Nashville, New Hampshire, police chief and city council had no interest in learning about Sharia. I don't know that training was ever brought to their attention, but they certainly did not have it. I mean, I just want, like your comment, Scott, was there any indication that they had any clue about Sharia, what it was? Was there any clue that they, in your mind, based on what you're learning about David Bores's class, is it fair to say that these people had no clue, and if they had been interested, they might have actually been interested in looking at the report? I'm just curious what your reaction is. Is there any indication these people up there have had any interest in learning the hard truth about Sharia?
I would have to say no interest at all and no clue at all. Because like I said, I bumped into Corey Lewandowski at the airport, and I had mentioned to him about Chief Willett. And he said, oh, he's a friend of mine. I will look into it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if anybody out there realizes that President Trump nominated Chief Willett as the U.S. Marshal, and I tried to reach out to Corey. I tried to, I sent emails to the White House and et cetera. So I'd have to say there's no clue whatsoever.
And again, the chief was promoted. Is that what you're saying? The chief was recommended for a serious position in the Department of Justice.
He was now he is the U.S. Marshal of New Hampshire.
Marshal, okay. Well, I can honestly say my own firsthand experience. There are people in the U.S. Department of Justice in the state that I'm associated with, namely Michigan, who they do not want to talk about the subject. So this is a challenge, a real challenge. We'll come back to that with some action items. Mary, let's switch over to you. You were a witness, like Scott, in a recent investigation in the state of Georgia. Maybe you could give your perspective of what you saw, what was involved, and then we'll kind of go back to the other people that know about that case as well.
Yes, it was quite a learning experience for me to go in as a woman into a mosque. I've been into a couple of others with other people for some of the care, open door mosque day, that kind of thing that is much different. This was actually for prayers and to just observe and understand what goes on. And visually, it was a bit, I guess, to me, a bit comical, but not. Because of some of the actions and some of the activity that they did in listening to the Imam speak and literally almost reading from a Sharia compliant, book, activities of what the men are supposed to do. And I don't want to get into details because it was pretty graphic and pretty bad. And the women are all in their own room listening to this, and all very serious. And I didn't understand it as prayers. It just was so foreign to me, but I guess I learned a lot. Going in and not a soul spoke to me. Nobody was mean to me. In fact, we went 2 days into the one, and there was only one woman in on the first day, and she did her prayers. I left her alone, and then finally I kind of looked at her and I thought she was done praying. And I noticed that there was an Arabic sign up on the front wall. And I said, just curious, can you speak Arabic? And she said, no. And she says, but I can pray in Arabic. And that was foreign to me. And I thought, well, then she's just repeating by robotic kind of methods to just say the Arabic prayers and not probably understanding them at all. Dave gave me some insight on all of that, and that's basically pretty normal because they don't read Arabic, they don't understand Arabic, but somehow they're taught the prayers in Arabic. Is that pretty good assessment, Dave?
Yeah,
Gaubatz?
that's a very good assessment. Anything normally in a mosque that is said in Arabic, the Imam or Islamic leader will also explain it in English. But what they do in a mosque for most people in America, most Muslims in America, as Mary had pointed out, from my study, they do not speak Arabic. They do not read or write Arabic. The little bit of Arabic that they do know is through the Quran and prayer only, and they're just repeating things. Most of the materials in a mosque may be in Arabic, but sometimes there's a good portion in English. But what they do is tell the worshipers to actually go online, get the English versions, and this is how they explain Sharia law. They do not, most Muslims do not read the Quran in its entirety. For every aspect of Sharia law, whether it covers the beating of the wife, child marriages, how to prepare for jihad qital, which is physical jihad, they come up with little pamphlets, booklets, maybe 10, 20 pages long, that are produced in Saudi Arabia, stamped normally with a Saudi government stamp. And these individuals then can read these 10 or 15 pages on whatever aspect of Sharia that they need to understand. And normally they are in English. Something about the Sharia law that we need to hit on is that Sharia, as I mentioned before, cannot be separated. A Muslim cannot say, I like this part, but I don't like this one. It's an all or nothing. Similar as an analogy to the 10 Commandments. If a Christian says, I like Commandment 1, 2, and 4, but I don't like 7, 8, and 9, it's not for me to judge if they're a Christian or not. But in Islam, they do judge it. If you separate even one aspect of Sharia, you are an apostate, you are subject to death, regardless if you're in Savannah, Georgia, you're in New Hampshire, or if you're in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Wow, this is very, very helpful for us to really get the inside story. David Bores, I want to go back to you. You were in the mosque. You were the citizen witness with Dave Gaubatz in Georgia. I'm just curious what you recall, what your recollection is of being in the mosque.
Okay, I was allowed to come into the mosque. Dave introduced me to one of the officials as his brother, and that I would then be treated as a guest. So when you go into the prayer room itself, you remove your shoes, which I did along with everybody else that went into the prayer room, and I was given a chair to sit on in the back of the mosque. Everybody else took their position on the prayer rug, a very large rug that covered wall to wall, as I recall, within the prayer room, but it was all lined out, giving everybody a line to stand on and a section in which to pray. So it was very regimented. People came in, the doors opened, I believe, around 1:30 on a Saturday afternoon. And the first thing that struck me is how people kind of straggled in. They didn't come in there all at once. But as I learned later from Dave, that the key is to be there in time for the actual prayer, not so much for what the Imam teaches prior to that, which we've just been talking about, but for the prayer itself. And once the signal was given that the prayer was about ready to start, there was a movement of the men to get as close to the front as they could.
Mad rush to the front wall.
And the reason, of course, is that you will be, your prayer will have more potency the closer you are to Allah, and the closer you are to Allah will be governed by how close you are to the front of the prayer area. So there was that movement, and then following that, everything was done synchronized, regimented. The men prayed all as one, put their heads in front of them on the rug, said their prayers, and then proceeded into a more upright position by still staying kneeling. And that repeated itself, I think, 4 or 5 times. There were many young children, male children, in attendance with presumably their fathers or other family members. I was struck by how well behaved these boys were. There was no playing or joking or what have you. They were very intent on replicating what the person they were with was doing. So they were in a learning mode. And then when the period of prayer was over, people left orderly, put their shoes on, and left the mosque. And of course, the traffic was quite congested. People, that's when the women also left and joined their families. But there are far more men worshipers there. I estimate it was over about, there were 5 rows of 35 men each that I counted, plus a partial row behind that. So I understand from Mary there was only about 19 women.
No, about 30, 35 women.
30, 35, okay. So they were far outnumbered by the males, and people have to understand it's not a requirement for women to go to a mosque. In fact, many mosques don't even allow women in. They're encouraged to stay home. That's considered their mosque. So women are far outnumbered in the mosque.
If I could add a little bit on the women's side of it, it was interesting to see that there was quite a mixture of what I think, if I described it to Dave Gaubatz, I think he would say that some of them were 100% Sharia compliant and some of them were barely Sharia compliant. And I mean that from the standpoint that there were some in all black and covered all but their face and hands. There were some in there with the pretty frills and the pretty little hijabs, and then almost the exercise pants, young girls 25-ish. So I wouldn't think that would be Sharia compliant to have those kind of tight pants on to be in there, but they seem to hang in their own little friendship, almost like a clique in high school kind of setting. But you know, I was surprised at probably 3 or 4 of them that were in fully covered black. So that one, that would say to me that they were fully Sharia compliant. Would that be a good assessment, Dave?
Yeah, that would be a very good assessment that they in particular were. What I look for in a mosque when I went with Mary and David, I really look at how compliant the Islamic leaders are in that mosque. And particularly the Imam, are they Sharia compliant? What are they advocating through their Sharia compliance? It's very important. If you go to a mosque, you listen to the lecture, the Imam rattles off for 45 minutes. If you don't truly understand Sharia law, it may be very, very boring is what you're going to end up with. But what I look for are key indicators that they speak about inside those 45 minutes when they talk about such terms as punishment in the grave, fiqh sunnah when they mention it, and various aspects of Sharia law. You've got to be able to read between the lines. Years ago, an imam would stand in America at the podium, and they would call for physical jihad. Well, our law enforcement and politicians took a crack at that because that was so obvious what they were doing. But now they've toned it down. They put it into the materials calling for physical type jihad in America. And the reason they do that is because most of our law enforcement and politicians will say, even if it's considered talking about the overthrow of America, they say, well, that's a First Amendment right, which is no more of a First Amendment right to call for killing law enforcement, which I found manuals to do that, or to overthrow our government. You cannot go into a theater and even yell fire. That's not a First Amendment right. In a mosque, it should not be allowed that you call for the overthrow of our country and the marriage and rape of young children. That is not a constitutional right.
David Bores, maybe you can help us with this other aspect of Dave Gaubatz. I think what Dave just said is critical. Inside the mosque, in words from the Imam and also from literature, there is the calling and the promoting of Sharia crime. That's what we talk about, all the way from child marriage, jihad, and sedition. But just to show the detail with which Sharia affects people's lives, I'm going to invite David and Dave to speak a little bit about what Mary wouldn't speak about, which was what did the Imam actually talk about? I'm not suggesting that this is critical, but I want people to get a feeling for the detail that Sharia tells people how to do different things. Remember, this could have been a call for violence in detail. Instead, it was a call for what? David Bores, what do you remember from the Imam? And Dave Gaubatz, if you can jump in. What did he talk about?
It was on personal hygiene. In a couple of words, they opened up talking about taking showers, washing your hands, and it had degenerated into more private body parts after that, and I'm not going to get into it, but it was very detailed, very graphic, but nonetheless, that's what's in Sharia law, and that's so you can get a sense from that type of detail. Is the Imam Sharia compliant? Well, he is. He's just telling his fellow parishioners, if you will, what's expected of them.
But David, if you, just for a little bit of clarity, it was all directed to men.
Right.
It was not directed to women at all. And that's the part that I thought all of these women with stone faces watching on a TV monitor, because of course they're not allowed in the men's side. So, but it was all addressed to men as if the women weren't even there. To your point that they're usually at home and that's where they're supposed to be.
I want to add to that what Mary just said. In a mosque, it is the responsibility of an imam to teach the men. That's the responsibility. Then at home, it is the responsibility of the man to teach the female and the children.
Wow. So this is more regimented than most Americans can ever imagine.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, people might think the hygiene issue is no big deal. The point, though, is that they are so committed to Sharia that the men will be trained and the women will hear about exactly these kind of things which have to do with hygiene. On the other hand, in the next meeting or the next communication that they could be telling a story about how Muhammad took multiple wives, took children for wives, and or slaughtered Jews. So the conversation about Jews being inferior could be addressed just as directly either in words or in the pamphlets as this conversation about hygiene. Is that fair?
That's very fair. You're going to find literature. I find more literature in a mosque pertaining to aspects of Sharia, like physical jihad, the slavery, everything else. I can find more material about that than you actually can a Quran. Sometimes I went to mosque and it's very difficult to ever find a Quran. You will find just a pamphlet explaining Sharia. Very dangerous.
So think about that. We have 3,200 official mosques. We have, I think Dave would agree, we have thousands more in storefronts and homes that are maybe not official, and they're pretty much no-go zones. And they're no-go zones until somebody like Scott contacts Dave, and Dave goes in, and then they're not no-goes. There's a report, and then the report is basically rejected unless there's an education that's been done, said, for example, by David Bores. So we have a massive problem of thousands of places where information about sedition, murder, child abuse is regularly talked and discussed with immunity. It's incredible that people just don't care. So we're gonna have some final comments. Before we do that, Mary, how about questions? Do we have some questions that we should get into, Mary?
Yeah, there's a few here. I've been answering a few online as well. There's a couple that are asking about specifics in terms of mosques and how bad is Islam in, and I'm going to give you a couple of states and cities. One is asking about Massachusetts, and another one is asking about Spokane, Washington. And if I could just add a commentary in there real quick. It was interesting to go out and do a little research before we started the program, and on worldatlas.com, there is actually a list of the top 6 states with the most U.S. mosques. And of all these states, New York, 257 mosques, California, 246, Texas, 166, Florida 118, Illinois 109, New Jersey 109. Think about the size of New Jersey and New York having that many mosques. And that just blew my mind. Now, I don't know what the date is on this, so probably it's a few years old and probably a lot more. But I just thought with the size of the state, now you could understand California 246 and maybe Texas 166, but New Jersey and New York with that many. So to come back to the questions from our attendees, any thoughts, Dave, on Massachusetts and Washington?
Yeah, I think people must understand when I rate a mosque, first of all, the Islamic ideology in itself and Sharia law are dangerous. Therefore, a mosque, I rate it as dangerous, very dangerous, or extremely dangerous. Having a mosque, when I went into Iraq in 2003 as a federal agent, the one place the U.S. government told us we could not go was inside mosques. So the first place I went was inside mosques in Iraq. They are places, they are military type organizations for planning, strategy, for weapons. When we did go to the mosque in Iraq, that's where we found the weapons. That's where they were hiding the weapons. Inside America, it is no different. They are areas, they are buildings, they are places for strategic planning on the overthrow of America, and they are for storing arms, as we found in many of the mosques. In Massachusetts and any of the places, they're dangerous. They're simply dangerous. The highest rate of danger I've found has been in Florida and Virginia. But each and every state is very dangerous. If they have a mosque, they're being directed through Sunni, which is basically out of Saudi Arabia, and for Shiite out of Iran. They give all directions to these mosques. If you got a Saudi mosque, it's dangerous.
Dave, let me ask you, I actually have a question myself. In the analysis you did for me, for my area, one of the qualifications is whether it's Sunni, Shia, or Sufi. Excuse me. And then you go into the Sunni, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali, depending on what qualifications those fall out to be. And you gave the qualifications for here. Out of all of those, is there any one of them that is less dangerous, or just they all qualify differently?
Well, they're all dangerous, but Hanbali is basically a school of thought, and we could have a 2-week course on the 4 major Sunni schools of thought. But I look at it like Osama bin Laden, ISIS, Al Qaeda, Jamiat al-Fukra. They basically use that school of thought. People can Google it, Hanbali, or they can email me. I'll give them more information. But the school of thought is how compliant they are.
Okay, we've got a question from Dave. He'd like to know what year that was that you went into the Nashville Mosque with the 7-year-old that you found.
Thinking back, I think that one was around 2008 that I went into that particular mosque, and it eventually got shut down.
Okay, we've got one from John. What can we as individuals do to help find out the locations of mosques? I think that's fairly easy to answer. You want to go for it?
Yeah, basically you just go to the internet and you'll find most of the mosques.
Yeah.
But it's going to take a lot more research to actually find the ones that are in basements and backs of convenience stores. It's got to take research, going into a mosque, start talking to the Islamic leaders and other worshipers. But basically, you go to the internet, you can find most mosques in your particular city.
Well, we've got somebody that's interested in asking the question. He believes that when the call for armed jihad is deemed the right time here on our soil, that it'll be broadcast over loudspeakers in Arabic. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but he said, what will it sound like? Any ideas?
Well, I think in the Middle East you would hear a lot of that. They're not really set up to be able to announce it that way.
Yeah.
They announce it Sharia compliant ways. One good example, and I'll just be brief. When Osama bin Laden was on years ago, the media would have him on. And sometimes they had media that would interview him. he sent many signals through his Sharia compliance. One in particular I'll just mention is when I was watching, one time he had his beard dyed in henna, black henna, and that's the coloring of the beard. The only time that a Muslim is supposed to color the beard in solid black to cover the gray is if they're calling for some type of physical jihad. They don't have to communicate it openly. It will be known. They will go through their different imams, through the mosque. People will know. The word gets spread. Remember, many times we may not even have electronics to be able to use, depending on what the situation is. The local mosques are the headquarters for all military action. A mosque is not built in a particular town or city unless it's for a particular purpose. Many times near military organizations, near law enforcement academies, they're strategically placed, and that's so important to know.
Mary, let me weigh in on that. I think that the first clue that people are going to have is when these sleeper cells are activated. We know that they've already crossed our southern border. We know they've crossed our northern border. These sleeper cells have been here for years. They're just waiting for the signal. They're dormant right now, but they are preparing. And I submit that before the mosques are activated, these sleeper cells will be activated. And once that happens, then the imams will be able to go public, and by then, of course, we'll all know as well. So
Right.
to me, the sleeper cells are the key. Many of those are controlled by Iran. They're Hezbollah related cells. We just saw the arrest of a sleeper cell individual in New York not too long ago, affiliated with Hezbollah. He was doing reconnaissance. So the indicators are there. The intelligence is there. We've been warned about it. Department of Homeland Security has publicized it. The only people who aren't paying any attention to it is our elected officials at the national level and our national media.
All right, we have, this is a question from Donna, and I think it relates to something you and I talked about offline. You had somebody, I think from CARE, tell you what the whole hijab is about and why women wear it. Do you want to talk about that? Do you remember what that was about?
Yeah, I used to give classes to law enforcement. I've trained over 3,000 individuals, specifically in Texas. And so I would get a better insight onto what was going on. I would hire senior care members to actually go to my classes so that I could learn from them. I wanted to develop a relationship so that they would start telling me certain things they would never tell the public. That's the only reason I had them, is so I could find out really what is going on in the mindset. I had care leaders, females, told me after 9/11, the primary reason that women are wearing the hijabs, more so Sharia compliant in the U.S., is to put fear into the American public. There's nothing that causes more fear to many Americans is up on an aircraft, you have 10 or 15 women in burqas, or if in the local shopping center that they're wearing the hijab. It is to put fear. Of course, they want to be Sharia compliant, but more so in America, it is because they know that many people are fearful of that. It's intimidating, and that's why they do it, to scare the American public. They want you subdued.
Unbelievable.
I think you can also say they're a transitional garment. Don't forget the hijab is a fairly recent item for female Muslim dress. It hasn't always been that way, just covering the head. And I submit, I've often thought about this too, in addition to the fear factor, it's a transitional garment. It is a way that non-Muslim women are persuaded to show solidarity with Muslim women, and they feel very comfortable putting a scarf through their hair. And they're just being duped. Laura Bush did it. Our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she showed her solidarity by putting on a hijab. They're not going to put on a burqa, but they'll put on a hijab to show their solidarity. So this is another way that the Islamization of our culture is being very subtly promoted by making it more acceptable for more women, especially non-Muslim women.
Mm. Well, here's a question for you, Dave Gaubatz. What can Dave tell us about mosques in Michigan, next door to Canada, and in particular locations in Dearborn?
Yeah, I spent over 2 weeks in Michigan. Only about 4 years ago, I went there. A lot of them are Iranian Shiite mosques, specifically in Dearborn. They are very dangerous. When I say dangerous, I'm talking about they have the material that when David Bores talked about sleeper cells, they have that type of material there for the people, calling for sleeper cells to be activated at certain points. I can tell you that Michigan is a place that ISIS and Al Qaeda and Hezbollah would feel very, very comfortable in.
Would you say Minnesota is as well, is as close to Michigan?
Yeah, one of the things I look at when I go to a particular mosque is what is the local government? Is it more liberal, conservative? Yes, and of course in Minnesota, which we spent a lot of time in, again, very dangerous. They're very open about what their objective is, and people must know the objective of Islam is to establish an Islamic Ummah nation worldwide under Sharia law. Everything a Muslim does is to meet that final goal.
That's right. I'd like everyone to understand how you write up your reports, Mr. Gaubatz, in terms of legalities, because it's a sworn document that people can then present to law enforcement, to their government officials, to their community leaders, as well as their community as a sworn document, so that if there's any question whatsoever, it's literally an affidavit proving the statements are true.
Yeah, and the key to that is that anything that I do or I say, I would swear to in any U.S. court under oath. So that's why I get the affidavit sworn to under oath, so that if I was called to court, anything that I say or write, I would swear to under oath. I think that's so important. Instead of just providing some information, I'm telling law enforcement, I'm telling politicians, subject to the penalty of law. If you find out that I'm lying about something in this report, prosecute me, send me to jail. But there's nothing in my report that is not accurate, that is not true, that I don't have firsthand evidence for.
Excellent. The last question we've got is someone wants to be able to get your book, Muslim Mafia, but wants to get it over a secure network. I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but I believe it's still out on Amazon, right?
And Barnes and Noble.
And Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, it is. You can still do that. Or if my email is shown, just shoot me an email. I'll get you a copy of the book.
Okay.
CARE of the Muslim Brotherhood has tried since 2009 to get that book banned in America. I don't want to go into any detail about it, but in the book there's 50 documents that we got from inside of CARE. We still have 11,900 pages that once the case is over, that we're going to release, and that shows the ties to CARE, ISNA, to Al Qaeda and other groups, criminal evidence that will get them prosecuted.
Again, the book is called Muslim Mafia. If you look over Dave's right shoulder, you'll see a copy of the book, and we've read it. We highly recommend it. There you go, Mary. Mary has the book.
Yes, and I've got it earmarked and underlined and everything else. So yes, I read it a while ago, and it's a good one.
So the story of the book in itself is worth a webinar. Maybe we'll delve into that at another time. Mary, any other questions?
No, well, they're asking for his email address, but I'm going to give it here in a moment. But no, that's the end of the questions.
All right, we're going to share the screen if we can figure out how to do that again, and we're going to actually go into action items. We'll invite our guests to comment on the action items if they choose to. Let's see if we can figure this one out. Here we go. All right, so action items. Dave Gaubatz, you're making a comment that we want to make sure people hear. The first one is do not go into mosques without training. Don't do this at home. Why don't you explain that, Dave?
Well, I think it's important. I get many requests for people who know very, very little about Islam and they want to go into the mosque. First of all, you're probably going to find nothing. If you don't know the material to look for, like Fiqh Sunnah, Sahih Muslim, Maududi, Kutub, and a dozen other pieces, you're just walking into a blank space. The lectures, you're going to learn nothing. If the Islamic leaders find out that you went into a mosque and that you're doing something against Islam, you're very likely going to be sued. You got to look at the risk and the benefit. You're probably going to find nothing in a mosque if you haven't got the proper training. Anyway, so if you go in, you'll find nothing normally. But if they find out who you are, you've got to be prepared for tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawsuits. Every time I go into a mosque, I make it public. But the organizations that would sue people know that I've had the training for almost 40 years. They know what I'm looking for, and they know I have firsthand evidence. And the last thing they want to do is go to court with it.
Okay, that's an important comment, I think. Obviously, if you have a situation where you think it's worthwhile, you can contact Dave Gaubatz directly. Dave, is that your correct email?
It is.
And request an evaluation, and Dave will interact with you. Okay, let's look at the next one. To the extent that you want that evaluation, that sworn affidavit report to be valuable and be perceived as a first step for investigation, it's really important for the peace officers and the prosecutors in that jurisdiction to know about Sharia, and that's where David Bores and his course comes in. This combination seems to me, and maybe I'll ask Scott. Scott, you may want to comment, but my thought here is that this is a 1-2 punch here. You want to make sure you get an evaluation of the mosque. You also want to make sure that there's fertile ground within the Justice Department in your jurisdiction, including a prosecutor, so they don't dismiss the evidence like they did in New Hampshire. Scott, does that seem like a reasonable combination to you?
Yeah, yes, it does.
And obviously it would have been difficult to get the training in there because I don't think they wanted it, but that might have made a difference.
They just don't seem interested at all.
Okay, well, I think this is, go ahead, Scott, sorry.
I've like I said, I've reached out to people in the New Hampshire area over and over again, and they just don't seem interested at all. I don't know where to go from here on that.
Well, you use the word go. We've had other meetings. We've had other presentations, sadly, Scott, where we talk about people who have done their darndest. This would be Jewish people in Paris who are figuring out where do they go? Well, they have a place to go. It's called Israel. We also had Katie Hopkins on commenting about where do Americans go? Where do Christians go? So this notion of, I'll just say it, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Michigan, where do the people go? In other words, if you cannot even get the training brought into Michigan, which right now the answer is no, you cannot, having evaluations, Dave Gaubatz was in Michigan, was in Dearborn, so this combination of a 1-2 punch going forward, I guess I would say this: if you have an opportunity in some other part of the country in particular, and you think there's a possibility that 2 days of training by David Bores will make the peace officers and the prosecutors train, and they will have no excuse but to welcome an evaluation by Dave Gaubatz, that might be a combination of a 1-2 punch you might want to consider. Let's talk about what you can do in terms of your own work, in terms of reviewing the website of the mosque, as well as Google searching the mosque, the leaderships of the mosque, and keywords like care. Anyone on the panel here want to comment on?
Yeah, let me jump in here. The very first class I gave for the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police back in 2012, one of my students Googled the local mosque in her jurisdiction, and she reported back that she found on the website a discussion about wife beating and how it was sanctioned under Sharia law. So this stuff is out there and it's not being cleansed off. I'm not saying that since then it hasn't been scrubbed, but nonetheless, don't take it for granted that these people are smart and they're not going to be promoting what Sharia law promotes. So it was very blatant that the mosque that she had in her jurisdiction, and she was the chief of police, was promoting violence against women. Now, in terms of organizations, the Council of American Islamic Relations Triple IT, the International Islamic, I can't remember what the three I's are. Mary, you can help me with that. But anyway, that's a Muslim Brotherhood front group that controls finances for mosques. Many of the mosques are the lease and the property is controlled by Triple IT, a Muslim Brotherhood front group. And you can get that off of tax records. I know that's another bullet point because remember, tax records are public documents, and you can find out a great deal of detail who the board of governors is on a mosque, who the imam is, who owns the mosque, and do a deep Google search on each one of those and see what you find out.
The case study that I've got in mind is in Michigan. There's a mosque, very big mosque. And if you look at their website, you'll see a reference to a newsletter. If you look at the newsletter, you'll see there's an education department division. You look on the education board and you see a name. Well, when you Google that name, you will find that that individual person was the past president of CARE Michigan. That was not hard to do at all.
You also might find out he's an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. There are 305 of them. So that's something else you can check up against. A lot of things you can do surreptitiously to help build a case that you've got some concern in your jurisdiction.
You might do enough work so that you would say, wow, this looks like a kind of a situation where I need to do get the mosque evaluation and contact Dave, and or I need to attempt to get some training into this jurisdiction for peace officers and prosecutors. So there's just some ideas. And finally, if you educate yourself so that you can hold local leaders accountable. The people in Nashville, New Hampshire, who just walked away from this did more than that. They scored points by calling Dave and Scott racist and Islamophobes, and so far that's worked out for them. The one guy, the chief, got promoted. So it's up to the individual citizens. We have responsibility as individual citizens, even if our local leadership are cowards and don't want to go near this. It's up to us about whether or not we're going to be brave enough to even touch this. And unfortunately, I think many of us realize we need to be brave enough to pursue this, or the country will go away. One last action item, we already talked about it. If you have not read the book, you should get the book. It'll put a lot of this in perspective, and it's a deeper story than just individual mosques. This has to do with the headquarters of CARE and the bravery of Dave Gaubatz and a person in his family named Chris, who did some pretty brave things, and that would be an action item for you to consider. We're going to move on and talk about what's coming up next, but before we do that, I'll go around and see if anybody has any closing comments. Scott, do you have anything that you want to just say to our audience based on your experience?
Yeah, I would like to add what you just saying about local leaders. Like I've already said who I've spoken to up in New Hampshire. I've gone to the State House, spoken to state reps, but I've also gone to Washington. I spoke to Trey Gowdy, I spoke to Devin Nunes, I spoke to Eric Trump last year. I've already mentioned Corey Lewandowski. It just seems like it just doesn't go anywhere. So I guess you just like Dave told me a couple years ago. He says you just got to keep speaking up and do the best you can, I guess.
Good work, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
Good work.
We're talking about brave people. Another brave person to cover up partially and go into the mosque would be Mary. Mary, what's your final thought?
Well, the one thing I didn't cover was that I was allowed to go in the front door, but I was not allowed to go out the front door. They literally filed me off to the side and put me in the side room, and then they made me go out a side door. So I wasn't worthy of coming back out that front door. So not quite what I'm ingrained with.
No invitation for a piece of pie and a cup of coffee.
Yeah, where's the pie and coffee? Come on, donuts and coffee.
Oh, now come on.
David Bores, what is your final comment?
Yeah, don't give up. I know this is overwhelming for a lot of people. We've given you some action items, and it's just going to take some of you actually doing them. There's not going to be a quick fix for this. Don't expect this thing to be resolved next week, next month. Trump can't do it all himself. This is a local fight. It's not going to be one at the national level, unfortunately, because that's totally compromised up there. So if we're going to do anything, it's going to have to be done mosque, by jurisdiction, locally. So it's time now to roll up your sleeves, get to work.
Contact Dave Gaubatz.
Yeah. I guess the other comment is to look at the political side of this locally. Sheriffs run for election and re-election. And you'll see something coming up where we try to help people evaluate candidates relative to their knowledge of Sharia, interest in Sharia, and you're really taking their temperature on courage. Are they courageous enough to speak about that? Dave Gaubatz, first of all, thank you for everything you do, and we'll ask you for a final comment.
Okay, thank you very much. I would tell all Americans and concerned individuals, we've lost over 4,000 people, our great troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. To keep in mind, they did not run. In America, we cannot run. Once we start running, once we start hiding, we have lost. For our children, do not run. As Scott mentioned, Mary mentioned, David Bores mentioned, keep on, persist, and make our people, our leaders, do their job. I would end this by saying, to understand Sharia law, you've got to self-educate. I'm talking aside from the courses that we all can get. If you want to self-educate, go to Halalco, H-A-L-A-C-O. Just punch that in on Google. It's a market right next to the most dangerous mosque in America, which is Darul al-Hijra in Falls Church, Virginia. All the Sunni mosques throughout America, that is where their worshipers go to order the material. You can find all of the jihad, physical jihad books on this website, open website.
Wow.
I would encourage people to actually go there, start ordering some of the material. Do not be afraid. Get the material. The best evidence is firsthand evidence. Find out what they are saying. That is one of your best sources. Self-educate, protect your children.
Spell that again, please.
It's H-A-L-A-C-O. Simply Google that, and then that market will pop up.
Well, hopefully you've gotten a real insight into the reality of these mosques. They're really here. They are really deceptive, but they're also very, very dangerous. If we're going to keep Sharia crime, whether it's mass murder or child abuse, out of our communities, we have to take action, and I hope you've got an insight in that. We're not finished. We've got more webinars coming up. We want to tell you about those briefly. Next Tuesday night, we've got a webinar with Claire Lopez. She's going to give us lessons from the sovereign nation of Israel, having just been there. We have another webinar coming up with Dr. Steve Kirby, who's a retired Los Angeles police detective, on the 23rd. He's going to be talking to us about holding Muslim public officials accountable. He's going to speak specifically about 3 amendments in our own Constitution, number 1, number 8, and number 13, and how do Muslim public officials justify their positions. How could they be public leaders if they are in fact Sharia compliant vis-a-vis their incompatibility with the Constitution? So we are grateful for your attention tonight. We hope you've learned something. Again, we are Sharia Crime Stoppers. There is Sharia crime. It is happening. It is being motivated. People are being incited to do these things. They may think they're Sharia compliant. We know they're actually, many of them are criminal, and some of them are extremely critical to even the ongoing existence of our country. We are part of the United West. If you think what we're doing is important, take a look at the website and look at the donate button. We genuinely appreciate Dave Gaubatz and David Bores and Scott and Mary tonight. And with that, we're going to say good night and invite you to come back next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.